You've probably heard your whole life that words matter, and they do. Words can move a person or a crowd of people to change the world, for better or worse. And they can be healing tools, healing individuals and communities. This is especially the case when the words are formed into a narrative story. And these narrative stories, also known as the human experience, they've been around since forever. Which came first, humans or stories? Was it an accident one night in caveman days, sitting around the communal fire roasting the woolly mammoth for dinner? Did a story magically appear in this moment to ease the day's hardship? If it's possible, I think stories emerged with the humans the exact same moment. Whatever the case about the origin story of our stories, we tell them, and we tell them, and then we tell them some more. They have been for sacred ritual purposes, offering spiritual comfort. They have been just for fun, jokes and little anecdotes, bringing those first humans to laughter, forming bonds across the fire. When we tell our stories, they can be universal in many ways, but at their core, the tellings are as different as we are. They can be dry, sparse on detail, or they can be lyrical and musical. They can be full of voice inflections, or they can be told with elaborate body motions and gestures. However they are told, stories are essential for human communication and understanding, which is why we share our stories with others, whether it's explaining a mundane task, outlining a complicated process, sharing something that happened, or a more formal telling. Stories teach us things about each other and about ourselves. And they allow us to escape from reality for however long the story lasts. Stories help us justify or clarify things we just can't figure out. They help us defend the innocent or the guilty and share the numinous. We have records of the Sumerian, Egyptian, and Greek myths, full of floods and quakes, droughts, tales of heroes and gods, tragedies, comedies. We tend to be drawn to stories most when we see ourselves reflected in them, sometimes even finding personal meanings beyond the intentions of the story. We fill our lonely and spare moments with stories. We tell our children tales of wonder. Stories comfort us and they reassure us. So, which came first, humans or stories? Jeremy Adams Smith tells us that we feel our stories in our bodies even if we don't mean to. He says that we think of stories as being these prosaic things. They're outside of us, just words on or pictures. But really, stories live under our skin. We know in our gut, he says, when we're hearing a good one. And I think he's right with this. Every culture has its own stories, and the stories shape and frame the culture. Cultural stories specifically form the foundation of how we think about the world. And they keep the culture. Those stories, they hold it. And we can pass on cultural knowledge from one generation to another. Stories are timeless. And they're an eternal link to ancient traditions and legends, myths, archetypes. They hold all kinds of truths for us, the storytellers, and us, the story listeners. Today, right now, I want to share a story that helped me when I really needed it. This is the story that put me on my lifetime journey of listening to stories and telling stories. It begins, as these sorts of tales often do, with once upon a time. Once upon a time, when I was a little girl, I lived in a magical tropical paradise. My father was in the Air Force, and my family moved to Hawaii. We lived there just about 4 years. And the whole time we were there, my mother wanted us to really experience Hawaii. So we lived off base, and instead of enrolling me in the base school, she sent me to one of the neighborhood schools. Mine was called Alva Scott Elementary. I spent my days outside of school wandering around the neighborhood, barefoot or in flip-flops, wearing tank tops and shorts. I was 7, 8, 9, 10. It was the early 1970s. There was no internet or video games to occupy me. TV then didn't really have children's programming for my age range. So I made up games to play on our family lanai, or in my backyard, or down in one of the many gullies filled with tangled trees and more flowers than the human can imagine. Despite the secret garden kind of frame here, I was pretty lonely. Now, I wasn't shy or even very self-conscious. In fact, just the opposite. But no matter what I said or did, I just couldn't make friends. Not on my street, not at my school. One day, my school class went on a field trip to see the Waikiki Falls waterfall. These are in Kaneohe on the island of Oahu, which is where I lived. I sat on the bus up near the front with the bus driver and a couple of the teachers, and I just watched the scenery go by as my classmates swapped plans and ideas. When we got there, I hung back at the bus, and I missed getting assigned a buddy. I was good at becoming invisible, and my teachers and the other kids, they left for the big reveal while I dawdled near the entrance of the trail. But the bus driver saw me. Maybe she'd been watching me the whole time. Maybe she recognized the loneliness of a child who was awkward and didn't quite fit in. She came over to me like she was just happening to, not like an adult who was going to scold. And without really making a big deal of it, she said I should hurry or I'd miss my friends and the whole point of the trip, which was seeing the amazing waterfall. I told her I didn't have any friends and I didn't care if I saw the waterfall. And she said, "Oh, but this waterfall, it isn't like any other waterfall." I must have looked like I didn't believe her. So she squatted down next to me and she said, "Let me tell you a story. It's about this very place where we're standing." Once, there was a little old farmer and his dear little wife. They built a home together right in this exact spot. Every morning, the little farmer would harvest his crops, and then he would drive his cart full of produce to the market to sell his goods. He would sometimes barter and trade for things that he and his wife had need of. Then he would return home to his dear little wife, and they would make dinner of whatever hadn't sold. They were very happy together. But like you, she said, they were outsiders. They had moved to this island from far, far away, coming here to make a better life together. They didn't really know any of their neighbors, and so they didn't really socialize with anybody. They never had any children to help brighten their days and lighten the workload, but despite that, they were happy, and their happiness came as kindness for others. Now, one evening, the little old farmer made his way home from the market. He was tired but thankful. It had been a good day, he thought to himself, as he drove his trusty cart pulled by his faithful horse along the winding road. He watched the sun go down, and in the distance, he saw a person stumbling under a heavy pack. He drew closer, and he realized it was a woman. It was an old woman, much older than he, ancient even. He didn't recognize her from the village, but there was something vaguely familiar about her. By the time he'd reached her, she had given up struggling with her pack and just sat on the edge of the road. The little old farmer pulled over and offered her a ride. But she, proud and unbending despite how tired she was, she said she had days left to her journey and didn't want to bother him with her troubles. He insisted that she let him take her at least part way down the road. The minute she seemed willing, he didn't wait for her to change her mind. He just lifted her pack and put it in the cart and then gently escorted her to the other side of the bench. As they rode along, she told him that many had passed her as she walked, but none had stopped. "If you'd honor us with your company tonight," he said, "my dear little wife will make you some dinner and you can rest until you're ready to continue. And when you're ready, I can take you the rest of your way." Well, she demurred, but her protests were losing strength as her eyelids drooped. They rode along in silence for a bit, and then the old woman shared that some passerbys had not just ignored her, but they had cruelly thrown objects at her. Some even spat on her. He said, yes, the people in this valley can be very cold. And he told her that he and his wife had come from across the ocean and had never been able to make friends. He said, we love our little farm tucked here in the nook of this mountain, but the people here, they are not welcoming. The little farm did indeed sit in the nook of a great valley with a tall mountain behind it, protecting it always. The house was humble, just a single room, but it was warm and comfortable and clean. The dear little wife bustled their guest into their home and plied her with warm drinks and hot food. And then she said, you are our guest, and that means that you're going to sleep in our bed, and I won't hear any argument. She said, tomorrow or longer, if you'd like, you can let my husband take you the rest of your way. We have plenty to eat, and the water is clear and sweet. They tucked their guest in as if she were the most honored person that they had ever met. And they said good night, and they put out the light. In the morning, the two awoke to see that a storm had rolled in. They hurried to check on their guest and to get the breakfast started. The little old man knew that he had a long drive ahead of him to get their guest to her destination, but he also had chores of his own to do, so he wanted to get started early. Immediately, though, they saw that she was gone. She'd neatly made up the bed and left them a note. The note said, thank you for your hospitality and your welcome. It means more to me than you may ever know. As payment for your care for me in my time of need, I ask you to promise not to leave your home for 3 days. Keep your animals inside as well. By the evening of the 3rd day, all will be clear and you can leave. This was odd, to be sure, but the dear little wife told her husband that they should heed this request. She had a feeling. He reluctantly agreed, but mostly because outside the storm was growing more intense. And this was no regular storm. Just as the little old farmer and his dear little wife had the animals tucked safely inside the barn, the long dormant volcano that the valley was tucked into the base of erupted. Smoke and fire exploded into the sky, blacking out the sun for the rest of that first day. And then the lava came down the mountain. It came down the hills, flooding hot and angry into the valley. For 3 days, the volcano raged, covering everything in its wake. Everything, that is, except for the little farm in the nook of the valley. But, my bus driver told me, the little old farmer and his dear little wife, they were safe and sound. The lava never touched a single chicken or goat. It never cut even a corner of their farm. The farm was an island in the middle of that lava flow. They stayed safe until the lava had hardened and it was okay to travel. And the biggest miracle of all, where there had once been just a mountainside, now this beautiful waterfall comes down. She said the couple decided that hospitality was what saved them. And so they invited their old friends from their original home. Soon, big families of friendly people came into the valley and began farming and sharing and loving one another. This is what we mean by aloha, she said. We mean welcome. And we mean, come let us offer you hospitality. And we mean, I love you. Then my bus driver leaned very close to me and she whispered, kindness is always rewarded, and wickedness will catch up with the wicked. That's Pele's promise to the people of Hawaii. I was captivated by this story told to me in the spot where it took place. Pele, whose name means she who shapes the sacred land, she's the goddess who was banished from her home, and she chose to come to Hawaii. The Pele story, told by a kind bus driver who was a stranger, gave me hope that someone understood how a little girl could be in a virtual paradise and still feel sad and lonely. This story in this moment helped me. Through our stories, we share our passions, our fears and sadness and hardships, joys. We share our dreams for ourselves and each other. They give us a common ground from which we can all speak, sometimes through metaphor and symbol, and sometimes also literally. Stories matter for all kinds of reasons. Remember I said at the beginning that all stories are felt in our bodies. As Jeremy Adam Smith tells us, when we tell stories and hear stories, the brain activity of both storytellers and story listeners, they start to align thanks to mirror neurons. As we become involved with a story, fictional things come to seem real in our bodies. And we know from science that hearing a good story literally lights up the neurons in our brains. When we hear these good stories, our brains release powerful hormones like oxytocin when we feel sympathy for the characters, and cortisol when we worry about the characters. If there's a happy ending for the story, we get a dopamine release. And if the story makes us laugh, we even get an endorphin boost. Stories matter because humans are storytelling creatures. We need stories in order to make sense of our world, in order to make sense of each other and ourselves. Stories, remember, are the perfect vehicle to teach us important things like empathy, self-awareness, and resilience. Stories have this special kind of magic that can open up our hearts and lift up our souls. Stories can point the way for healing and transformation. Our lives are stories. We are stories. Sometimes our stories are about fighting not quite literal monsters. Sometimes our stories are smaller, maybe vignettes of interactions with a cast of characters. When you understand the story that you're part of, understand the role that you play, the you story, then you can begin to see how you can heal the wounds of the past. You can begin to heal yourself. The same is true of any community. When we share our own stories and listen to the stories of others, that community can begin to grow and love and heal any sadnesses or wounds. It begins with understanding that we are our stories. It begins with once upon a time.